Okay, last lecture for spring break. So this is the start of World War II. So we've been looking at what's happening domestically throughout the 1930s with the Great Depression, but what's taking place internationally is also very important and significant, and that is the lead up to World War II. This is how we get into World War II. So setting the stage here, what I want you guys to do is pay attention to the process. Right? What does it take for someone like Hitler to take power? What does it take for someone like Stalin to take power? And this pattern of their ascent to power, who supported them, how they took control, is really important. And so I think it's good for us to pay attention to this process. How do we go from a free society or one filled with ideals or whatever to a totalitarian regime? What happens when civilians give up their civil liberties? Right? The other theme I want you to look at is sort of what people are capable of. Right? We often dehumanize or demonize the enemy, but I want us to look at what we're capable of too. Right? What makes people do what they do? Are we capable of such evil? Is everyone capable of this type of evil? And is it just, is this something that we are capable of doing as well? So as we talked about, right, the build-up to World War II has been taking place throughout the 1930s. Mussolini takes power in Italy in 1922. Lenin dies dies in 1924, and Stalin takes over and becomes the dictator of Russia by the late 1920s. Japan begins expanding their empire and invades Manchuria in 1931. Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933. Italy invades Ethiopia in 1935. All of these countries have been militarizing and preparing for war, getting ready to fight, right? Building up their militaries, building up their infrastructure in order to support a war, and training their soldiers, stockpiling weapons, all of that. In the meantime, France, Britain, and the United States have primarily just been trying to survive. The Depression hit the West and hit the West hard. But while Germany was able to militarize to get out of it, support Hitler's ascent to power and begin this militarization process and production process in order to put the German people back to work, the three major democratic world powers attempted to find alternate solutions. It was also easier for Germany to do this because they were under a dictator, right? So what Hitler said went. So Hitler said, militarize, you militarized. Whereas it was a lot more controversial and there was a lot more opinions going into it for the US, Great Britain, and France. Impact in terms of what this would have on war, right? So this is going to be really significant when we get into the fighting. Germany is prepared from the get-go, whereas the Allies, Britain, France, and America, are completely unprepared for war. Right? So we're put at a huge disadvantage because we have not been preparing the way that Germany has been preparing. So at the offset, they're ready to go, whereas it's going to take us a little while to get there. In terms of our financial position, it's also important to note, right, and to remember that it's not the New Deal that really got us out of the Great Depression. I mean, obviously that helped play a big relief effort. The job creation that will go along with wartime is really the thing that's responsible for pulling us out of the Great Depression, right? That's what gets us out. And that's, we're going to start producing a huge amount because we're going back to war, very similar to what we saw in World War I, right? So we were $19.5 billion in debt at the start of the Great Depression. That goes up to $40.4 billion by the start of World War II. And so our economy is going to be heavily recovering during the war, but war is expensive. So our country as a whole is still going to be heavily in debt. But like we've talked about, right? Debt and money isn't really real. So, So now let's look at all of the different elements here. Who is involved? How do we get involved in World War II? So the first country or region of the world that we're going to look at is Asia. And primarily we're going to be focusing on Japan. So Japan basically had been rapidly industrializing and westernizing starting in the early 1900s. They want to become a world power. Remember, they had started this in World War I, right? They got involved in World War I by sort of shouting their support for Great Britain from across the room, right? But not really. They basically just took over some German islands and knew that either way they'd probably be okay. If Germany won, Germany was likely not going to come over and take those islands back. And if Germany lost, right, it looked like they helped in the war effort and they got the islands. So win-win for them. So Japan starts building its empire. The first real wave is going to take place in 1931 when Japan invades Manchuria. They are taking advantage of a worldwide focus on the Great Depression, and they claimed that they were provoked by China. So Manchuria is a region in China. But essentially, they're doing it because they think that they need more power to prove their superior status, right? They're doing something very similar to what the U.S. was doing in our imperialistic era, right? We want to prove that we're one of the big boys. We want to prove that we can play with Europe. And so, in many ways, Japan is doing a similar thing of wanting to prove that they are this great people and great empire in a way that we had done as well. So, they invade China as a means to prove that. Of course, they will justify it just like we justify our stuff by saying, well, China provoked us into doing this. Japan will remain an occupation of China, despite warnings from Britain, France, and the US, and they refuse to leave, essentially. We say get out, they say no. Because of this, Japan is kicked out of the League of Nations, but still, no one else really does anything about the Chinese occupation, right? We're all preoccupied with the start of the Great Depression. So while we say don't do it and we kick them out, we don't actually change anything. And so Japan will remain in occupation of China through World War II. So for well over 10 years. And this starts this long occupation. The Japanese occupation of China as a whole will manifest itself in what we call the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is there at the bottom of your screen. And this is an undeclared war and military conflict between Japan and China, and it will last largely from 1937 to 1945 as Japan expands its control throughout China and begins taking over. Neither Japan nor China officially declare war, and the reason they do this is because they don't want to alienate the United States, right? The U.S., if we remember back to the very end of the New Deal lecture, we had passed something called the Neutrality Act, and we said that we can enact the Neutrality Act on a country who has declared war, right? If there is no formal declaration of war, we could not put that embargo on. We can't enact the Neutrality Act. So if Japan and China, both of them essentially were trying to avoid openly stating war so that the U.S. wouldn't cut off trade with them because they both wanted to trade with us. We focus a lot on the German atrocities of World War II, right? We talk a lot about the Holocaust, and we talk a lot about the raping and pillaging of Russia, and then when Russia's doing the same things. We've mostly focused on the German atrocities because the German atrocities are absolutely horrific. I mean, it's genocide, right? They're wiping out an entire group of people. But we need to note as well that Japan is also responsible for some of the most heinous crimes against humanity during World War II as well. And one of the worst of these offenses can be seen through the rape of Nanking. This is brutal, just as a warning. The rape of Nanking begins December of 1937, and the Japanese Imperial Army marches into one of China's capitals at the time, Nanking, and proceeds to slaughter over half of its residents, so 300,000 of the 600,000 residents. The Japanese had been held up at the Battle of Shanghai because right before this, so Shanghai falls to the Japanese in 1937, and the Chinese put up a much larger fight than Japan was anticipating. And this upsets the timetable that the Japanese had wanted for their conquest. And frustrated and angry, they enter Nanking and they wreak hell. They managed to take over Nanking quickly. There's a less organized resistance there, and after only 4 days of fighting, they enter the city. And all of the soldiers were given instructions to kill all captives. What's important to understand here, again, with the psychology of war, is part of Japanese military culture at the time was the notion of dishonor associated with surrender, right? You do not surrender. That is dishonorable. And we will see this continually throughout World War II. The idea is you fight until the death for your country, right? You do not give in. You do not surrender. And anyone who surrendered was considered subhuman, right? That was a trait of inferior people or inferior races. We will see this come up again continually throughout World War II. Not only is it detrimental for the Japanese soldiers because they would oftentimes be simply abandoned in battles that they could not win and told, once the Japanese military realized that it was an unwinnable battle, like at Iwo Jima, they will just be like, okay, bye, right? And leave them there with no hope of escape and no getting out. And they would be told, you have to fight to the death. That's what you do, right? It's dishonorable to not do that. And we're not going to try to come get you. But also this manifested itself in the Japanese treatment of their captives or anyone who surrendered to them. And it is brutal because they believe that those who surrendered rather than died on the battlefield were not worthy of respect. They treat all of their captives as subhuman, right? Not worthy of respect. So, in terms of numbers, if that helps, by the end of World War II, approximately 1 in 20 POWs would die in the German camps. So for every 20 prisoners of war, one of them would die. In the Japanese POW camps, 1 in every 3 would die. So the Japanese POW camps were absolutely brutal. And that's largely due to this mentality. But this also has this huge effect on the civilians of Nanking. So when they enter Nanking, they're told, kill all captives, kill all of the people who surrendered. And it was a bloodbath. First, the 90,000 Chinese soldiers that were in the city who had surrendered were systematically killed, taken out and executed. But part of what makes Nanking so brutal is really the way in which all of this is carried out. The Chinese soldiers were rounded up, transported to the outskirts of town. As soon as you arrived, the Japanese soldiers began the slaughter. Younger soldiers were encouraged by their superiors to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Those were the instructions upon these Chinese POWs as a way to toughen them up for future battles so they can, stomach it. So they're being told not just kill everybody, but torture and take pleasure in it. There's actually video footage and photography documenting the brutality, and they'll show, smiling soldiers conducting bayonet practice on live prisoners, decapitating them, displaying severed heads as souvenirs, proudly standing among mutilated corpses. Some POWs were simply mowed down by machine gun fire, which weirdly seems almost kind in comparison to some of these other things, but other people were tied up and soaked in gasoline and burned alive, or tied to a stake and used as practice for bayonets, right? So how accurate can you be in your stabbing of them? After the destruction of all of the POWs, of all of the Chinese soldiers, the Japanese soldiers turned their attention to the women of Nanking, and an outright, horror nightmare hunt ensued. Over 20,000, some of the higher estimates go well over 80,000, so probably somewhere in that range of Chinese women were gang raped by Japanese soldiers and then stabbed to death with bayonets or shot, so they could not bear witness to this. Almost any time a female was seen on sight, she would be raped. This includes girls younger than 8 and women older than 70, so anyone. It was about power and control. Pregnant women weren't spared. There's these horrifying accounts of pregnant women being raped and killed and having the babies torn out of their stomachs with bayonets. And soldiers would prey for several months, just preyed on the population, doing whatever they wanted and terrorizing entire families and murdering half of the people here. There are horrific reports of girls being gang raped to death and forced incest. It's truly, truly horrific. So for 6 weeks, Nanking is going through this. And murder and rape become sport. So the point of all of this is, right, is that the Japanese are just as culpable as the Nazis are for these war crimes too. And so it's just important to recognize that this is also something that happened, and just because it wasn't to the European populations, this is still one of the other major horrors of World War II. And so this is only going to expand as, the rape of Nanking is one of the most, brutal specific moments, but the Japanese throughout the war do some truly terrible things. All in all, they're responsible for an estimated 20 million deaths, largely of the population of China. And this violence will sort of change and mutate a little bit. We're going to see massive drug use throughout China. So we're seeing a huge opium spike. We're also seeing the beginning of the comfort woman system, which is forced prostitution of all of these young girls. Over 200,000 girls between the ages of 13 and 20 will serve as comfort women. This means essentially being used as a sex slave all day and being raped by dozens of different Japanese soldiers daily. Most of them will die. Many of them will be murdered to cover it up. And Japan will justify all of this and all of this horror by basically claiming they're freeing Asia from European control. So all of this European imperialism that we've been doing, Japan's freeing China from all of that. But in reality, it's just horrible, and Japan's just trying to become an imperial power. Most of this was actually covered up by the Japanese government. It's not until 1993 that the Japanese government even acknowledged that the military was involved in establishing brothels across Asia. It's still left out of most Japanese textbooks. They do not mention any of the sort of massive comfort women stuff. They don't mention the rape of Nanking. That does not exist in Japanese history, despite the fact that there are witnesses from survivors and all of that. And so this is absolutely something that happened, but not something that most people were held responsible for, accountable for in Japan. We will look more at Japanese-U.S. relations with the Battle of Pearl Harbor and whatnot, but all of this is just part of the lead up to the U.S. entering the war, and so it's important to understand this mentality of the Japanese army. And just like we've talked about with, different European armies and whatnot are being raised with this, it's like from day one, right? Since you're kids, the Japanese are taught and convinced that they are superior in every way to so many of the other races, but it's taken to a whole new level in the way that this is carried out in World War II. And of course, this isn't everybody, but like this is the mentality that's fostered in much of the army and encouraged by sergeants and stuff. So not good. This is, we can just see a slow expansion of the Japanese empire, right? Each color is will show a date range of when and how they expanded into this area. But throughout World War II, this is all of the parts of Asia that they conquered. So they were absolutely expanding for imperial purposes as well. Okay, focusing our attentions back to Europe. Let's look at Southern Europe. So in Italy, Mussolini has been gaining power. He takes over national power in Italy in 1922, and Mussolini actually coins the term fascism. And under his fascist regime, he does, he probably executes one of the most successful fascist governments. But he will do press censorship, right? He dubs over movies that he doesn't want people to hear all of. He abolishes all political parties. He establishes a secret police system who maintain order and silence his critics. And Hitler will ultimately base his regime on Mussolini's empire. Right? He looks at Mussolini and is like, yep, that's what I want to do. And so he will largely sort of take inspiration from how Mussolini ran his country. In Spain, we have an attempted military coup by Francisco Franco, which will lead to the Spanish Civil War between 1936 and 1939. Franco will be yet another fascist regime and was supported both by Hitler and Mussolini, but Franco will largely stay out of what's happening with the wider World War II. The Spanish Civil War is fascinating if you have time to look at it. There's all of these different factions fighting. It's fun outside reading. We unfortunately don't have time to do this in class, but it's a really interesting conflict. And we actually have like American legions going over to fight in the Spanish Civil War, despite the fact that we're not getting involved, but we have American patriots who are like so driven and like, yeah, let's bring democracy to Spain and fight Franco, that we have volunteer Americans going to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. So there's some really interesting stuff going on there. And then Mussolini will begin establishing while Spain's going through civil war, Mussolini will begin expanding his power. So he will invade Ethiopia in 1935. It's extremely brutal fighting. The Italians use chemical weapons, tanks and machine guns against the native populations who have spears and bows and arrows, and they were completely slaughtered indiscriminately, and it was terrible. But yeah, so Mussolini will finally officially enter the war in 1940. The war starts in 1939. But in 1940, he will declare war on Britain and France and come in to join Hitler and Germany. And then Italy will switch sides a couple times, but we'll get there. But what Mussolini is trying to do, right, what we can see with all of these empires, same with Japan, same with what Germany's going to do, is Mussolini is trying to reestablish the glory of Italy, right, reestablish what the Italians had lost and create the new Roman Empire, right, the next world order. So now let's go ahead and focus on Germany. So in Germany, we have Hitler, as we all know. So Hitler's rise to power was gradual, right? He starts out, we've talked about him before, but right, he starts out as, this artist who didn't get into school, and he serves in World War I and almost dies, but did not. Bummer history. But he will be thrown in prison for a short while, right? And after trying to do a coup, there he will write Mein Kampf, and then he will sort of begin expanding his ideas, and he will run first for office before being appointed chancellor. So he's appointed Chancellor of Germany in 1933, same year that Roosevelt takes office. And he takes advantage of the poverty and dissatisfaction of the German people, which was really brought on by the Treaty of Versailles in the aftermath of World War I, right? Hitler's fascism offered both restitution and a solution for the people of Germany. And for them, it's a way to right the wrongs committed against the German people and restore German glory. He's responding to some very real grievances that existed among the German people. But his assertion is, follow me and I will solve all of this. I just will solve all of this in a truly horrific way. So under Hitler's regime, we see a very similar process as Mussolini's, right? That's where he gained inspiration from, where people's constitutional and civil rights begin being suspended, competing political parties are eventually banned, Nazi supporters begin burning books that seem to have problematic content, right? We see massive propaganda schemes, but one by one, people's civil liberties and people's rights begin being taken away. We see the establishment of a secret police, we see increased control, all painted as a necessary measure, right? Hitler, contrary to popular belief, he was not voted in by a majority of the German people. He was voted into a position in government by a faction of the German people, and once there, he managed to sort of do a very smart political maneuvering to gain full support and be appointed chancellor, but he was not overwhelmingly supported by the German people. So the Nazi Party promises several things, and this is what makes them so appealing to the German people. So they promise to create jobs, to restore German glory, and to avenge the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. And those are things that the German people desperately need and want. The biggest ones being jobs, and food and success, right? And to be this glorious country as they once were, which is part of how World War I got started, and to, prove and, take back control after the Treaty of Versailles, which was so terrible to them. And they're very successful. The Nazis create jobs by boosting the military, starting a rearmament program. So they're building tanks and aircrafts and preparing people for war. They're training people. The ostensible goal was the requisition of territory that had been taken from Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, right? They claimed to be focused on taking back Germans' rightful territory, so taking back the territory that they had had pre-World War I, that the Allies had stripped from them in the Treaty of Versailles. So that's what they were trying to gain. But of course, part of this too is they're also focusing on the eradication of any ethnic group or political group which is in contradiction to these policies and these politics. Hitler also will then start plotting, right? And he will start creating his ascent to power. So one of the things that he does early on too, which plays into this militarization, is he institutes compulsory military service, meaning every young man who's eligible must join the military. So that starts in 1935, meaning he's militarizing the population, training soldiers, in addition to just creating the weaponry. And then in 1936, Hitler and the Nazis and fascist Mussolini will come to an agreement known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, where they're basically like, yo, we like you. We approve of what you're doing. Let's be buds and be allies with each other. So that will start, and it's very clear that that alliance and that friendship exists there. In 1938, Germany is going to annex and occupy the German-speaking part of Austria. And so this is really when we're going to start seeing Hitler begin to expand and appeasement begin to start. So Hitler, by annexing, we basically just mean taking over. So he invades part of Austria, and he's like, okay, this part is now mine. All the people here speak German, right? This used to be our territory. We should have this. And in response to this, Britain and France are basically like, I guess that kind of makes sense. And we didn't say you couldn't do that before, even though we kind of did. So let's pass something called the Munich Agreement. And the Munich Agreement is passed several months later. And basically what this says is France and England both recognize that it's okay for Germany to take over this territory, and they concede it to him. And they say, okay, you can have that. That's yours, right? This area that you have taken over is yours. That's fine. But you can't take over anything else. And so the Sudetenland, that word there down at the very bottom, it was the next territory that Hitler had taken over, which is the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland. Germany claimed that the people there, once again, were an ethnic German majority, and the Western powers gave up this land in an effort to appease Germany and to avoid European war, because Hitler promised no further European territorial claims, which of course we know isn't a thing. So this begins the policy of appeasement. Hitler takes something over, we say, okay, that's fine, you can have it, just don't take any more. Do we think Hitler was happy with just the Sudetenland? Absolutely not. Less than 6 months later, Hitler directly violates the terms of the Munich Agreement and seizes control of the remaining portion of Czechoslovakia. And we don't really do anything about it. Okay, so as all of this is happening too, so shortly after Hitler is appointed chancellor, he also starts changing his domestic policy. So he passes what we call the Nuremberg Laws. And the Nuremberg Laws essentially classify who is German and who is not German, right? What does it mean to be German and what qualifies you as a German? And so they basically deprive Jews and other non-Aryans of German citizenship. They begin doing things like prohibiting racially mixed sexual relations and marriages. Later laws will extend this to gypsies, black people, and bastard children, so children whose parents born to not unmarried parents. And ultimately, what the Nuremberg Laws will do is prevent Jews from participating in German civic life at all and stripping them of all of their rights, which is just going to lead straight into the Holocaust, as we know. As Nazism takes hold of Germany, anti-Jewish sentiment only continues to grow. In November of 1938, we have what's known as Kristallnacht. I can't pronounce anything German. Sorry, Veronica, if you're listening to this. Or the Night of Broken Glass. And this is essentially a series of anti-Jewish riots known as a pogrom that follows in the sentiment of the Nuremberg Laws. So basically targeting any Jewish-owned store. Synagogues are burned down. Jewish-owned stores were looted or burned down as well. Jews found walking in the streets were attacked and beaten, sometimes murdered. And in the wake of this, even more anti-Jewish laws will be passed as well, which begins confiscating Jewish property, prohibiting Jews from attending school and driving cars, and restricting what they're allowed to do in daily life. So it's this series of laws and this process where things continually get worse and worse and more restrictive until it becomes increasingly difficult to leave. And if you didn't see the signs early, I mean, things get pretty bad. Shortly after the Night of Broken Glass, we're going to see Hitler begin the deportation of Jews to concentration camps en masse. At first, these concentration camps are just work camps. It's not about mass extermination yet. That's not going to come until the final solution in 1942, which is when he's like, okay, I'm just going to murder everybody in the most brutal ways. But that being said, even though the camps are not about mass extermination, they're still about death. And usually the goal is essentially, we are going to work you to death and starve you until you die and replace you with the next round of Jews. So the intent is exactly the same. It's not the mass gas chambers where we're killing as many people as possible and trying to be as efficient about it as possible. But the intent is to brutally work you to death. So the camps are still about death, even though they are work camps in the early years. The German borders in these early years too are not yet closed. So some Jews have the ability to flee and leave, and many did. I mean, we still have plenty of Jews living in the United States whose families fled Germany while they still could have gotten out. But the reality for many people is they didn't feel like they really had a place to go. America upheld its immigration quotas. We restricted the number of Jewish immigrants coming over. And all of this, of course, is happening in the middle of the Great Depression. So this stems from a fear of job competition as well as anti-Semitism and our just general isolationist sentiment. But we do have 8,500 Jews accepted annually between 1935 and 1941. And of course, we try to emphasize people who have higher profiles. So this is where Albert Einstein will come over, for example. But we are definitely still very restrictive. and both for a combination of racist reasons, but also the Great Depression's happening. Outside of the anti-Jewish laws being passed, Germany is continuing to expand, right? So like we talked about, they seized the rest of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. Partially because of this, France and Poland pledge a mutual military assistance in May of 1939 because both France and Poland border Germany. So they're like, if Germany is trying to expand in here, we promise we'll help each other. But as all of this is going on, Hitler and Stalin are also signing a treaty. And this is going to be very important. So the Hitler-Stalin Pact is a treaty of non-aggression, and they signed this in August of 1939, right before the war officially breaks out. It's essentially a mutual non-aggression treaty, right? They're agreeing that they won't fight each other. They also secretly divide up Eastern Europe and the Baltic into an equal division of, quote, spheres of influence. And they essentially don't want a two-front war. Right, so for the Soviet Union, part of the reason why they're doing this, why Russia and Stalin are doing this, is because they're focused on Japan's occupation of China. So they established peace with Germany so that they can focus their efforts on Japan, right? They're paying attention to Japan and making sure that Japan doesn't expand up into their territory or take over too much of the important control of China. Remember, they had also fought Japan in the Sino-Japanese War back in 1904. So they've got, some of that history there, and they really don't want to fight a war on two fronts, particularly because Russia is so huge, right? It takes a long time to get people from fighting, hypothetically, from fighting the Germans to fighting the Japanese. So they're paying attention to the Japanese. Stalin just doesn't want to deal with Germany right now. So along the lines of claiming lost land, Germany is going to invade Poland in September of 1939, and this is key. The invasion of Poland demonstrates the Germans, basically it's the Germans demanding the return of German areas taken after World War I. And they're basically saying, Germans in Poland are being persecuted, so we have to come take this over. So Hitler will invade Poland September 1st of 1939. And finally, this is going to be the last straw. The UK and France are like, okay, Poland is it, right? Poland is too much. We're not giving you Poland. And so they give Germany 2 days to get out of Poland. And if they don't, then war would be officially declared. Of course, Hitler does not leave Poland, and so war is officially declared September 3rd of 1939, officially starting World War II. So Poland was that final straw. Unfortunately for England and France, they are completely and utterly unprepared for war. But remember, Hitler's been preparing for war for the last 6 years. He has a huge advantage, whereas England and France have been really struggling because of the Depression. So heading into this, the Allies are at a huge disadvantage here, and Hitler is really looking incredibly strong. The Soviet Union is then actually going to invade Poland too, unfortunately, from the east. Poland will surrender in October, technically to Soviet forces, not German forces, but Poland is going to see some of the worst fighting of World War II and suffer the highest percentage of casualties of the entire war. Just so we have context here, this is Europe. Look at where Germany has taken over and how much they control now. So we have Germany there, if you can see this, right? So they've invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and now Poland, and continuing to expand, right? They're about to invade France as well. And keep in mind, we also have friendly fascist dictatorships in both Spain and Italy at the time. So when France falls, right, and then they're having a treaty with the Soviet Union. So when France falls, Britain's really left kind of out in the cold here, and it's a huge bummer for them. Okay, we're getting close here. So American neutrality. The U.S. really wanted to stay neutral, despite the growing unrest in Europe, right? We're in the middle of the Great Depression. We're dealing with all this stuff. So we passed multiple neutrality acts in an attempt to stay uninvolved in the conflict. Right? We're throwing tons of money into all of that. So we just don't want to get involved in another European conflict that would cost American lives. All of that sounds horribly unappealing to us. So in total, we decide to pass 4 neutrality acts. One in 1935, one in 1936, one in 1937, and one in 1939, all of them adding on or altering what we can and cannot do in an attempt to avoid getting involved. You do not need to know each of these and each of the separate ones in detail. I'm going to briefly tell you about them, but I'm not going to test you on that. The first Neutrality Act declares an arms embargo on any country that is warring or at combat. So essentially we did this in response to Italy invading Ethiopia. The Second Neutrality Act prohibits bank loans, so prohibits banks to loan or credit any nation who is at war. So if you're at war, we won't loan money to you. The third extends the arms embargo, saying we won't sell you weapons, to include anyone who is involved in a civil war. And this would be Spain, right? Spain had just started their civil war. And we also prohibit travel on, quote, belligerent ships. So basically, like, you can't travel on a Spanish ship, for example, if that was the case. And it prohibits any goods that will be used for like weapons. But we do allow what we call cash for carry. So we can still sell goods just for cash. We won't credit nations. And then the Fourth Neutrality Act is 1939. And what this does is recognize the Nazi regime as a threat to democracy. And says that now war supplies can also be sold on a cash and carry basis. So essentially, if the British or French want to come pick up weapons from us and pay us in cash for them and then sail them back, that's fine. But we're not going to send American ships to go over to France or Britain and bring with us that stuff. So quick review, why are we isolationist? Well, there's a huge belief sweeping the country that participation in World War I was a big mistake, and that staying out of the war is in America's better interests, and that we should not get involved in European conflicts that do not concern us. Now, of course, that is hugely going to change as Hitler begins taking over more and more things, and then when the Japanese get involved. And then pacifism is the other one that plays a role in this, especially from church-going groups, college students, which is really interesting to look into. And that raises a lot of questions, just sort of broadly, that you should be thinking about is there a thing as a just war? Is war ever necessary? Can pacifist movements be harmful? Or are they always a good thing? But officially what ends American neutrality, of course, is the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese in 1941 on December 7th. So the lead up to our involvement. So one of the big tickets here, and what really starts getting us more involved, is when France surrenders to Germany. So France falls to Germany June of 1940. The fall of France is terrifying and traumatic for Americans. This means that England is the last remaining real democracy in Europe that has power and strength and whatnot. And that scares us. So keep in mind, too, it takes us like 2 years to get involved, right? September of 1939 is when the war officially starts. We don't get involved until December of 1941, so a full 2 years before we get involved. But when France falls, we freak out a lot. And U.S. neutrality permitted the president of the U.S. to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, or lend, or otherwise dispose any defense article to any such government whose defense the president deems vital to the defense of the United States. This is known as the Lend-Lease policy. So the official Lend-Lease Act is passed March of 1941, and the hope of the Lend-Lease Act is that we would send guns, not sons, right? We would send supplies to the democratic countries versus sending our soldiers over. And so we're trying to keep our boys out of the war, but still do what we deem right, and prevent Hitler from taking over everywhere. While we do not officially declare war until after Pearl Harbor happens in 1941, in reality, the Lend-Lease Act is an economic declaration of war. So essentially an abandonment of neutrality. Even though we do not have soldiers over there, we've given an unofficial declaration saying this is the side that we're on. And even though we're not sending soldiers over, we are helping finance and create enough stuff for the war to happen. Meanwhile, in Russia, so in the Soviet Union, Hitler is getting a little too full of himself. He is proud of the ease in which France went down, which was far too quickly. Oh, you French. Even though it was not him being super awesome, but rather the French making some poor decisions. So he sets his sights on the oil and resources of the Soviet Union. He wants to use them to defeat the UK. So Hitler will attack the Soviet Union in June of 1941, breaking the Neutrality Pact with Stalin. This is a big mistake, as the Red Army and ultimately, so the Russian army and ultimately the Russian winter will halt Hitler's army. Moscow does not fall under the control of Germany, but remains independent. Hitler has now violated this treaty, and Stalin angrily is going to throw everything that he has at Hitler. And so Stalin will join the Allies, so Britain and France, and the invasion of Russia is going to prove for some of the most brutal, bloody, horrific, war crime filled battles of the war. Far more than the Western Front, although the Western Front is terrible as well. So this is a very poor decision. It's going to spread Hitler too thin and be problematic. Okay. So finally, Pearl Harbor. So we had instituted an arms and oil embargo against Japan in late 1940 because they had invaded China, right? So we say, vacate China and we will trade with you again. Japan's not super happy about this. They want all the resources and they want their empire. And so they basically decide, okay, screw diplomatic relations. We're going to war. We can do this. We're going to prove ourselves. The Japanese hope was to hit the U.S. so decisively that the majority of our fleet would be destroyed. And in the time that it would take us to recover and rebuild that, they would have taken over most of Asia and won and sort of taken control of what they could have taken control of. So they think that they can do this quickly and efficiently. So what they do is on December 7th of 1941, the Japanese sent in a suicide bomber or multiple suicide bomber planes into Pearl Harbor, which was a military harbor on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. It's one of our biggest military bases. It was a surprise attack, and it caused over 3,000 U.S. casualties. So 2,403 Americans were killed, and 1,178 others were wounded. It destroyed American aircraft carriers, battleships, and essentially the entire U.S. base and fleet. As the Japanese had hoped, the attack on Pearl Harbor did immobilize the fleet, but it also united America, and we did spare several very important carriers, which we had sent out on practice missions earlier. So we did get some important stuff saved there. But this unifies America. And 4 days later, on December 11th, we will declare war, one vote shy of a unanimous decision. And that is our official entrance into World War II. This was devastating to the American population, very similar to 9/11. We didn't think that we could be hit here. We were not anticipating this. We had thought we had calculated it all with the Japanese, right? We're like, well, we know that they can't make it there and back to bomb us. We know that we're safe in that way, but we hadn't anticipated that the Japanese would send over suicide bombers. We just assumed that they would drop bombs and then fly back, and we knew they didn't have planes capable of that, and so we didn't pay as much attention as we should have, and we're unprepared for this. But this was completely devastating, and this is what pushes us into World War II. Okay, and finally, this is what the map looks like by early 1942. The red is Germany, the pink are German allies, gray countries are neutral, so Switzerland and Spain there. And the blue is the Allies. And in Asia, the Japanese have kicked out the U.S. and all other European strongholds from everywhere except Hawaii. So basically, this is not looking good for the Allies on the, midway into World War II. Germany has control of everything. Their allies have control of everything else. We have the Soviet Union and we have Britain hanging out there. But other than that, this is not good. And Germany could have just had control of all of that if Hitler hadn't invaded the Soviet Union and turned them into an enemy as well. So we'll pick up with details of World War II and what it looks like both at home in America and overseas when you guys get back from spring break. So enjoy the rest of it. Bye.